Our next speaker is Dr. Susan Arthure. Dr. Arthure currently teaches and researches at the Department of Archaeology in Flinders University, South Australia. And I think it's fair to say she's kindly brought all the lovely weather from Australia over to us today. A native of Trim, County Meath, I believe. She's lived in South Australia since 1987. This year she completed her PhD in Flinders University with the wonderfully titled A Long, Long Way from Clare to Here, an archaeology of the Irish in colonial South Australia. Her research focuses on the archaeology of Irishness in colonial Australia, and she's published widely on topics such as the social identity of the Irish in Australia, folk traditions, folklore, the archaeology of health. Her co-edited book, Irish South Australia, New Histories and Insights, addresses the much underestimated, and I think it's fair to say under-researched, impact of the Irish in South Australia, and challenges Victorian and in some ways these enduring prejudices against Irish societies in colonial Australia. She has a fabulous blog as well that you should all look up, which channels the great Christy Moore, I think, in www.don'tforgetyourshovel.com. So check it out. So please welcome Dr. Susan Arthure, whose paper title is Under a Southern Sky, the Irish Settlement of Baker's Flat in Colonial South Australia.
Thank you, that was a great introduction. So when I present in Australia, it is common and respectful practice to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where we live and where our research takes place. So today I want to acknowledge those lands, even though I'm in a different land. In the lands in what is now known as South Australia, they are the traditional lands of the Garna and the Ngadjuri people. And I honour their elders, past, present and future, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So today I'm going to talk to you about the history and archaeology of an Irish settlement called Baker's Flat in colonial South Australia that retained its Irish identity for upwards of a century, and it was the focus for my PhD. So Baker's Flat is located near a small town called Kapunda, about 80 kilometres north of the state capital Adelaide, in an area of South Australia known as the Mid-North. And some years ago, when I first set foot on Baker's Flat, I walked across this paddock and it was scattered with ceramic and glass fragments and the very occasional pile of stone rubble. And next to many of the rubber piles were pepper trees, which are these big trees. And in Australia, these are markers of 19th century colonisation. And next to them were small thorny bushes resembling Irish hawthorns. And for the first time since I'd been living in Australia, I felt a sense of Irishness in my surroundings. So what did I feel that others did not, and what did I see? I was certainly biased by the knowledge that I had been shared with me, that this had been the site of an Irish community in the 19th century. But it was also the banded ceramic ware that I found on the surface that reminded me of Carrigaline pottery, and the box thorns reminded me of the hawthorn. So I set out to investigate the Baker's Flat site and the people who had lived there. But first, let me tell you a few facts about the colony of South Australia. It was established in 1836, so it's essentially a Victorian-era colony, and it was deliberately designed to replicate a slice of England in the Antipodes. So it was based on a scheme called the Wakefield Scheme, where men who were already wealthy could increase their wealth simply by buying land and waiting for it to increase in value. So it was a utopia for land speculators and capitalists. And in fact, Michael Davitt, who visited South Australia in 1894 as part of a fundraising tour, described it as a utopia for capitalists. So into this heady mix of largely English money and speculation came small numbers of poor Irish Catholics. Very small numbers, because South Australia was very well known for its antipathy towards Catholics, especially if they were poor and Irish. In 1854, some of these Irish Catholics arrived at Kapunda, seeking work in a booming copper mine. And they settled themselves on a large parcel of land that was lying idle and unused by the legal owners. It was very convenient because it was located close to the mine, and it was also rent-free, so they didn't have to pay anything to be on this land. This was the land known as Baker's Flat, and the Irish took it under their full control, even though they were essentially illegal occupiers. And they quickly formed what was described as a close, fiercely Irish community. There are estimates of about 500 people living on Baker's Flat when the copper mine was at its peak in the 1860s and 1870s. And they were seen as having like a very strong Irish identity. They built houses that looked like Irish houses, and you can see this on the screen. This is a depiction of a cluster of Irish-style houses at Baker's Flat based on a series of photographs that was taken in 1906. These Irish had a very strong Catholic faith, and they also danced to Irish music by firelight on a common area in the Baker's Flat site known as the dance floor, and they played hurling on Sunday afternoons. So a photographic series from 1906, which that drawing on the previous slide was based on, shows these houses and a few others built in the Irish vernacular style. So you can see that they've got a rectangular design, that they're single story, that there's a steep roof, that it's thatched. So visually, the houses would have appeared Irish. And the records of a court case, which was Forster et al. V. Fisher, hint at more. This case began in 1892 and went on for a decade. And it pitted the Irish illegal occupiers of the land against the lawful owners, who happened to be some of the most powerful men in the colony at the time. And if you go to Adelaide today and you see the libraries, the buildings, the streets, they're named after these men. So these were the cohort that held control in South Australia, and the Irish were going up against them. In the court records, there are suggestions that the Baker's Flat Irish had adopted a very traditional Irish way of managing land and community, the clachan-and-rundale system. So where houses are clustered together and the land is managed cooperatively. And this cluster of houses is obvious in an 1893 survey plan, which was done as part of that court case with the legal owners. And it was prepared for an ultimately unsuccessful sale of land during that court case. So you can see the little black rectangles are all houses. The poor surveyor who did the survey did it under duress because he was in danger at any moment of being thrown into the River Light by the Irish. Once he was trying to convince them he was there to survey for a railway line, but they were wise to that pretty quickly. So then he had to gallop away and complete the survey from a nearby hilltop. So it's not entirely accurate. But these records, the photos and the court records, they're important because clachans are difficult to recognise for outsiders. For somebody observing Baker's Flat from the outside, for those wealthy landowners, for the English in the neighbouring area, the settlement would have appeared disordered, chaotic, illegible, because it's hard to read the cluster of dwellings as a type of order. And it's difficult from the English landowner's perspective to see anything other than chaos in the animals roaming freely without fences. And certainly this is the story that was recorded in newspaper articles of the time. Chaos, tumble-down huts, wretched hovels, cows, goats and geese all running wild, no apparent order. So how to investigate a site where there's very little written down in the published histories? In the published histories, there's about 500 words written in total, which were written to begin with in a compilation of edited articles in 1929, and were then recycled over and over again in anything that was written about Baker's Flat from then on. So there was really nothing new about Baker's Flat, and it did all buy into that stereotype of wretched hovels and lawlessness. And it was also barely remembered except by a couple of people in the Kapunda community. And also how to explore what seems to be like a really strongly Irish settlement in a really strongly English colony. So the slide is a summary of the methods I used. Firstly, a geophysical survey, which was designed to collect subsurface data associated with things that I thought might be there under the ground. So the original footprints of dwellings or outbuildings, fences or enclosures, maybe old paths or roadways, and the dance floor where people played hurling and where they danced by firelight. So after the geophysical survey, then I did excavations over 2 field seasons across sort of 8 broad areas of interest, and that was based on those results. And then came the cataloguing analysis of almost 20,000 artefacts in the lab, and you can imagine my excitement when I was faced with nearly 16,000 pieces of rusty metal. The ceramics and glass held much more appeal for me. There was a lot of archival research which underpinned the archaeological results, including a search of all of the SA newspapers for any references to Baker's Flat. We're very fortunate in Australia to have a national library system called Trove, which digitises old newspapers and makes them freely available. The state government records, including and particularly for the Forster et al. V. Fisher court case, which ran to nearly 1,000 pages. Then genealogical data for details about specific families, and I was able to identify data for 145 separate families on Baker's Flat, all of whom had lived there at some point over nearly a century. And then folklore data I used from the National Folklore Collection here at UCD to think about traditional building methods and materials, fireplaces and chimneys, floors and foundations, generally building material and how people built dwellings. And what I was trying to do with all of this was to cover every element of the community, the kinship and alliances, how the landscape was used, the types of vernacular architecture being built, the artefacts of everyday life. And this was to try and determine the extent of its Irishness and how that identity had been maintained over many decades. So I think at this point, probably need to give you a little bit more background about the settlement, because the Irish occupation of Baker's Flat, as I've hinted already, was not trouble-free. So the Irish were not very popular in the broader community. And this aligned with colonial South Australia's poor attitude towards Irish Catholics generally. At Kapunda, the general feeling was that they drank too much, that they were dirty, which always annoys me because in 19th century South Australia there wasn't a lot of water around, so pretty much everybody would have been dirty most of the time. Anyway, the Irish were dirty, they were lawless. They didn't manage their animals in the approved way. The animals were renowned for roaming freely without fences, and Baker's Flat was described in the newspapers as a blot on the landscape. And later, as the mine was winding down and it was no longer convenient to have the Irish very close by, the legal landowners decided that they wanted their land back. But the Irish had no intention of giving it up, and this led to continuing conflict. So attempted evictions began in the late 1870s, coinciding with the closure of the mine. And the screen shows a town mural in the town of Kapunda. And if you can see the detail in it, it shows a group of spirited Irish women, and they're shown seeing off the bailiffs, using brooms and sticks and boiling water. And this was not unusual in Baker's Flat, women being at the forefront of resistance. And it's reminiscent of the land war that was happening back in Ireland during the same time. So during the land war in Ireland, women were essential to the protests and the agitation. They were taunting bailiffs, they would throw mud and stones at police, they blocked roadways with their bodies. And even when men were present, the women took the lead in challenging the authorities. And the same thing, the exact same thing, was happening on Baker's Flat. So these are deliberate strategies. And the Irish land war was well covered in the South Australian press, and the Baker's Flat land war was then using the same tactics. So there's a very dramatic story that I love from 1880, when 3 poor, hapless men were sent by the legal landowners, who weren't going on there themselves, to erect a fence on Baker's Flat. This was a tactic that under the legislation would help to establish their ownership. So the women were having none of it. Up to 100 of them turned out to drive off the would-be despoilers of their hearths and homes. So the fencers managed to dig a single post hole, and immediately one of the women leapt into it. And she declared that any further excavation would have to be through her body, and the entire group of women decided that they would all shed blood to save their land. And at the same time, they were in groups of 20 and 40 and 10 so that they could communicate with each other about who the fencers were and where they were and what they were doing. Anyway, 3 fencers went into a huddle, had a bit of a discussion, wisely decided to retreat. And they were sent on their way by the women using brooms, sticks, and shovels. In the court case that followed, the 6 ringleaders were named, and I always like to name the women because they have been not named for so long. So the 6 ringleaders were named as Anne Slattery, Mary Callahan, Mary Lacey, Mary Josie. This is Anne Hoare, and this is an earlier image from about 10 years previously, because at the time of this particular conflict, she was about 55. And Catherine Driscoll. And again, this is a later image from her older years. She was about 36 at the time of this story. And can you see that she's like side on in the photograph? The family folklore says that she was on her way home from Mass one day, got into an altercation with a young boy who threw a stone at her, and she lost her eye. And from then on, all photographs were showing her good side. Anyway, these troubles at Baker's Flat continued for many years, eventually coming to a head in the court case, which began in 1892. With the aim of selling off the land and getting rid of the Irish once and for all. So the records of this court case contain hints at how the Baker's Flat land was being managed. The landowners offered some of the occupiers the chance to buy some of the land, and a series of affidavits highlights how the Irish were working together and the expectations of mutual obligation. So there was a man called Thomas Jordan. He occupied a hut and 1.5 acres, and he said that the occupiers had already held 2 meetings to consider their position. So they'd held meetings. Unless they could run their cattle on the whole of the said section, they could not live there. So this was 140 acres that they were managing. And until they were forced to leave, they had all determined to remain. So these are group decisions. Michael O'Brien, who occupied a hut and 1 acre, sort of appeared tempted, but said, "It is no use my buying the land, because if I did, the others would go against me. And any person who did buy the land would not be allowed by the other occupants to live there." So these are hints that the clachan-and-rundale system was in operation, where the Irish were making decisions together about how best to manage the land and cattle. In other court cases, it becomes clear that a man called Daniel Driscoll was the de facto leader for the community. He was described in the court case as their spokesman, and by one of the witnesses for the prosecution as the head robber Barabbas. So the Driscolls were probably the most influential family on Baker's Flat. So remember Catherine Driscoll with the eye? She was married to Daniel's cousin Patrick. Catherine was also Mary Lacey's sister-in-law. Mary was one of the other women ringleaders, and Mary had been born a Driscoll. So these family connections are important because family and kinship are at the centre of clachan settlements. And on Baker's Flat, many of the families came originally from County Clare, although they didn't necessarily know each other when they were there. Sometimes they forged links on voyages to South Australia, or maybe different families created bonds through marriage or friendships. So remember I mentioned there were 145 family names identified so far on Baker's Flat. This slide shows one small element of this. The images show the marriages on Baker's Flat that generated at least 2 connections to other families. So just not a marriage between one family and another, but that then created extra and additional connections over time. It turns out it's like a web of interconnections, alliances, and obligations, and right at the heart are the Driscolls. So the family connections offer some insight into kinship bonds on Baker's Flat. The court records indicate how it was being run as Rundale. The clusters of houses on the 1893 map hint at a clachan, and the photographs show Irish-style houses. So using this data from the archival record, I thought it should then be possible to see a lot more information in the archaeology, like evidence of the clusters of houses and Irish vernacular architecture. So for the geophysical survey, we concentrated on the northern part of the site where the red rectangle is, and this is where many of the clusters of houses were on the 1893 map. And we found several areas of interest. You can also see what the landscape looks like in the photograph on the left. And it was about 37 degrees Celsius when we were doing that work. So it was hot and it was dry and it was pretty dusty. But we ended up with a map that looks like this, where we're interpreting the Baker's Flat site based on geophysical data from magnetic radiometry and also from ground penetrating radar. So you can see the red blobs, sort of rectangularly shaped blobs. They, I was thinking, would be houses, structures, dwellings of some kind. The rectangle, purple and triangular lines, not naturally occurring lines, straight lines, so we thought they may indicate field enclosures. Over to the right of the slide where there's the sort of the mesh, that's the dance floor area, which the landowner was able to tell us was very, very compacted, and the geophys confirmed that it was very, very compacted. And the line of green down the side is a line of slag taken from the copper mine, which we think was used as sort of enclosures or whatever for the fires that they would light along the side. The brown areas as well are sort of rough paths that we think were used to get from one area of the site to another. So all of those results helped me to decide where to excavate. And here in this big field with no obvious structures remaining above the surface, except for several large pepper trees, which indicate a domestic dwelling nearby, usually in South Australia. And the red arrows indicate the areas that we excavated over 2 field seasons. And here over trenches A and F, we excavated the remains of a dwelling. So in the first year, we excavated the southern end of that area, which I'm calling a dugout dwelling. And when I'm talking about a dugout structure, I mean a structure that's dug into the shape of the land. In the 19th century in Ireland, the poor of Ireland were very familiar with the concept of digging into a slope or a hillside to create a shelter or a dwelling. Often the gables and the floor and the front wall were made of sods of grass or turf. The hearth would be at a gable end, at floor level, with the smoke escaping through a smoke hole in the roof and no chimney. At the same time, the poor of South Australia were also living in dugouts, but their architecture was quite different. The dugouts shown on the screen were constructed at another copper mining town called Burra, about 80 kilometres north of Baker's Flat, and these were built by Cornish miners. And here the entirety of each house was dug into the banks of a steep creek. So the 1851 drawing, it illustrates like how they nestled into the high sides of the creek, and sort of like a terrace of houses, with a front door, a window, chimney stacks. Every single house had a chimney with a chimney stack on the top. Even some of them had verandas. So when people talk about dugouts in South Australia, this is what they're talking about. Sort of, and generally and often built by Cornish miners at that time. Back on Baker's Flat, this dugout wall is very low, and it acts something like a retaining wall. So the dugout wall is the long bit on the left-hand side. There are cuts along the top surface, regular cuts. These probably held the supports for a wall and a roof, the remains of which we found tumbled inside the structure. And the cut is into calcrete, a type of limestone that's very, very prevalent in South Australia. The floor surface, which you can see with some channels on it, is also calcrete. There's a cobbled path to the east, and that's almost certainly outside the structure, because a rubbish dump was excavated close to and immediately south of the cobbles. In the second field season, we excavated the remainder of the dugout structure, the northern end. So we started at the southern end and then we just continued going north. And you can see from the northern and eastern walls that the retaining wall has continued. So it forms a rectangular shape. In association with these walls, we found the remains of flattened kerosene tins, sometimes covered in hessian. And kerosene tins were commonly used in South Australia as a form of of walling, to build walls against wooden supports. So just as that here, they appear to have been used to build walls. Interestingly, the doorway is not in the eastern wall where I would have expected to find it. Instead, it faces south. but that's out of the prevailing wind. A very strong wind comes in at 3 o'clock every afternoon, and you would need to build your wall facing, or your door facing south to avoid it. The cobblestones uncovered the previous year extend here, and then there's a small annex near the front door with what appears to be shelves or tiers in it, but they're not flat, they're on a slope, and I think they're possibly for roosting poultry. So looking at the overall structure, it's essentially the remains of a rectangular Irish house dug into the slope of the land, and the annex echoes an Irish custom of having a small space with a single opening for sheltering poultry or young animals. So overall, we're looking at a rectangular structure, 1 room deep, 10 metres long, 4 metres deep, and in this conjectural drawing we can see that it looks like a typical Irish vernacular house. Extended frontage to accommodate the south-facing door, and a tiny annex to accommodate poultry, probably 2 windows based on some of the scatters of window glass that we found at 2 locations. A thatched roof, which would have been covered over at some point by galvanised iron sheeting, which we also excavated from the middle of the trenches, and hessian underneath the thatch, which would have been used as a lining to prevent bits of thatch falling into the house. In this particular house, there's no evidence that a chimney ever existed. The hearth was at the southern gable end, and the smoke would probably have escaped slowly through 2 smoke holes in the roof at each end of the house. So we have a house, but we excavated other areas of the site too. And here, there's a sad story about our possible field enclosure over trenches B and C, because this was where that rectangular and triangular shape had shown up in the geophys. It was about 60 metres long, about 40 metres wide. To begin with, we excavated using hand tools. We reached natural surface without ever finding anything that looked like an enclosure or a fence. Then I went back with a backhoe. But after the backhoe had excavated 7 metres of a planned 15-metre trench, the bucket arm snapped because the ground was so hard that it was impossible to go any further. The bucket arm snapped, it was unable to be repaired. This area remains unexcavated and a mystery, but given the clear magnetic signature in the geophysical results, it is possible that it does contain the remains of a wall or some type of enclosing feature, possibly built using slag from the mine, which was available in abundance and used elsewhere on the site. And that slag is very strongly magnetic in signature and was maybe what was showing up. So the excavation over another area, Trench E, southwest of the house, was much more successful. So this uncovered a small round structure that did not align either with the typical shape of a domestic house or the form of an agricultural outhouse. It was almost 4 metres wide, with walls built directly on the natural surface and no foundations. The internal floor was smooth and unstained. It was coated in a thin layer of white lime slurry and imprinted at one point by the base of a bucket. There was a stone entranceway that was demarcated on the inside by the remains of 2 timber posts, 82 centimetres apart, and on the outside by an edging of mixed stones, slag and brick. And immediately to the right on entering the building was a circular stone fire pit that contained ash remnants. So this was very puzzling, but after researching various forms of Irish vernacular buildings, it looks like this was one of the most Irish features of all, a sweathouse. Like the clachan, these were ubiquitous in 19th century Ireland, but as they fell into disuse, they also fell out of memory. Based on the excavated evidence of the typical Irish sweathouse, this is what it might have looked like on Baker's Flat. Nestled into the slope of the hill, the primary purpose of the Irish sweathouse was for health, to sweat out an illness or an ailment, and most were built into banks or rising ground, maybe looking a little bit like a thimble, with low doorways that could be easily sealed. They were often covered with earth or sods of grass. Most were circular in shape inside, some were D-shaped, and although they were often close to water for cooling off afterwards, this was not critical. Prior to a sweathouse being used, a fire was maintained inside for at least 2 days. Once the walls and the floors were thoroughly heated, the ashes were raked out and the floor spread with green grass or straw to protect the user's feet. Here on Baker's Flat, the entrance gives no indication of how high the original doorway would have been because we just had foundations, but the doorposts are in the correct position to wedge a temporary door in place. The clean nature of the floor is consistent with it having been swept out numerous times, and the ripples and the bucket imprint are further evidence of the floor having been regularly washed down. And there's evidence of a fire pit just inside the door. So why would the Irish have built a sweathouse on Baker's Flat? The answer is most likely because it was what they had always done to manage health, in the same way as the clachan-and-rundale system were what they had always done to manage land. The sweathouse may have been another means, like the clachan, of giving that community every advantage, especially in terms of managing health in the early days, when doctors and medicines were hard to come by. So as well as the data we've been able to get from the geophys and the excavation, there is also lots to find out from the excavated artefacts. But for my last few minutes, I just want to focus on the remains of 21 teacups and 10 teapots, which hint at the importance of tea drinking on the site, and how the consumption of tea in this small Irish house differs from other South Australian houses at the time. So there's a minimum number of 10 teapots in that house that we excavated. The largest could have held up to 2.4 litres of tea, so it's enough for about 10 cups. Most are fairly utilitarian, but there is one higher quality decorated teapot with this beautiful, highly vitrified black glaze and a geometric gilt pattern. 10 teapots does seem like a lot, when it appears especially that by the end there was only one elderly woman living in the house. And just for comparison, in other working class households in South Australia, much smaller numbers of teapots have been excavated. So in a Burra dugout, so the Cornish miners' dugouts, in one of those, one teapot was excavated. In Port Adelaide, which is the working class port area of Adelaide, in neighbouring working class cottages, 2 and 0 were excavated. And at an Irish Catholic house in Melrose, much farther north in the Flinders Ranges, 1 was found. So 10 teapots for one woman. There are also 21 teacups, none of which match. And they don't match any of the saucers or the creamers either, which is very unusual on Australian sites, where matching cup and saucer pairs are common. So when I think about teapots and tea sets in the 19th century, I think about respectability, which the Irish were not really renowned for, and the ritual of afternoon tea. So even poor women of the 19th century could project respectability as they poured tea for their friends into paired teacups and saucers. But I think what is happening on Baker's Flat in this house is a deliberate non-conformity to respectability, because here the tea wares were not about manners, they were not about the tea ceremony. These women did not need to bond over a tea ceremony because their bond had already been forged through alliances and friendships and land and fences and jumping into holes and activism. And the larger ratio of teacups to saucers, which is 3.5 to 1, even suggests that there was no requirement for saucers, except perhaps maybe when the doctor or the priest called in. And this is the Irishness of it. It's like community-focused. Tea drinking on Baker's Flat was functional rather than symbolic. It's more about the social togetherness and exploiting the familiarity of kin, more than the need for a staged performance of respectability and domestic bliss. And so, what do we know now about Irish identity in the South Australian settlement of Baker's Flat? Firstly, we have a clachan. Baker's Flat was a clachan. It's the first complete exemplar to be recognised so far outside of Ireland. That it survived for almost a century demands that the Baker's Flat Irish consciously and continually maintained this system and based on a robust sense of Irishness. They were living this traditional cooperative community and it perched on the edge of a capitalist economy that was driven by mining and farming. They continued to build structures in the Irish vernacular style. They managed their land and stock cooperatively, and they maintained strong kin networks through their shared origins, through astute marriages, through long-standing friendships. There's a continuation of vernacular architecture, a continuation of building structures that align with Irish vernacular tradition, houses that are evidenced through excavation and contemporary photographs, and also what is most likely a sweathouse to help meet the health needs of the community. There are really strong kin networks. In the absence of kin networks based on blood, new networks were based on shared origins and journeys, on friendships and alliances that were constructed. And one family, the Driscolls, emerged as community leaders, both the men and the women. And the Bakers Flat community, over almost a century, stayed strong enough to resist incursions from outsiders, to preserve a shared architectural style, and to engage in cooperative land management. There was a central role on the site for women. The clachan was managed without visible boundaries or fences, but the colony of South Australia was heading in a very different direction, with this very clear English ascendancy and hierarchy, the enclosure of land, and the comprehensive adoption of capitalism. So at Bakers Flat, in a little small colonial land war, the physical manifestation of this was fences. For the legal landowners, substantial boundary fences were required to assert ownership and control, as well as to exclude the Irish. But when they sent in the fencers to build a fence in 1880, almost 100 women, including 3 of the Driscoll clan, saw them off. And women remained at the front line throughout the occupation of Bakers Flat. And women were the last people living on Bakers Flat as well, including my unknown elderly woman who liked her cups of tea. I'm not going to say anything more about tea, except, of course, that it enhances community relationships always. And the end result for the Bakers Flat Irish was that no matter how hard the legal landowners tried to get their land back, or how the broader community looked askance at the troublesome Irish in their tiresome settlement, those Irish would continue managing the land and stock as they were used to, declaring their Irishness through vernacular houses and drinking tea without saucers, and looking out for each other until they were either ready to move on or no longer needed the land. So they were retaining their traditions and their Irish identity under a southern sky. Thank you. And the last photograph is the only photograph that has been found so far, was found very recently, of a woman on Bakers Flat in 1907 inside a building. It's the only known photograph so far, and again, she's unknown as well. Thank you.